This is another webinar organised by the EMUK's International Committee, and it's open to all EMUK members. It continues the format that we've used at the International Committee of selecting for discussion a major area of mutual concern for the UK and the EU. And the agenda this evening is really essentially on foreign policy. We're very honoured to have as our principal speaker Lord Ricketts, Chair of the House of Lords European Affairs Committee, whom I'll introduce in just a moment or two. But his subject, as I hope you all know, is UK-EU relations in a world of disorder. After his talk, I'll call on our CEO and former Defence Minister, Sir Nick Harvey, to make a response. And then after a brief conversation between the three of us, the floor will be open for questions and answers from the audience. Our EMUK colleagues, Michael Anderson and Scott Daniels, who work tirelessly on EMUK administration, communications and technology, will help facilitate this whole process. I anticipate that this section of the meeting will conclude around 7:10, leaving time for brief reports from myself and from our Vice President Molly Scott-Cato, respectively on the recent European Movement International Federal Assembly, and the equally recent EMUK political delegation to Dublin. But let me now introduce our principal speaker. Peter Ricketts was a British diplomat for 40 years. In the later part of his career, he was UK permanent representative to NATO from 2003 to 2006. He was permanent Undersecretary at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office between 2006 and 2010, and Britain's first National Security Advisor from 2010 to 2012. And then he was British Ambassador to France from 2012 to 2016. After retirement from public service, he was appointed a crossbench member of the House of Lords and has been chairman of the European Affairs Committee since June 2023, last few months. He's a non-executive director of NG and Eurotunnel, vice chairman of the Royal United Services Institute, and president of the Normandy Memorial Trust, responsible for the British National Memorial in France, to all those who fell under British command during the Battle of Normandy in 1944. His first book, Hard Choices, published in 2021, The Making and Unmaking of Global Britain, was published in a paperback edition with a new foreword in early 2022 by Atlantic Books. It was widely praised for the clarity of its analysis of Britain's place in the world, backed by immense diplomatic experience and wisdom. And I must say personally, I highly recommend it. Just a couple of quotes from Lord Ricketts before I pass to him, which I think is so relevant to the European movement UK. He's written, I personally think there is a risk of the UK being sidelined on global affairs as a consequence of Brexit. And I think he's added to that, the UK would find it harder to have its voice heard in a world of blocs dominated by great power competition. Well, with that introduction, let me now pass it over to Lord Ricketts. Thank you.
Well, Richard, thank you very much for that more than generous introduction. I'm delighted to be having a discussion with the European movement. Let me just say that I do that in my personal capacity rather than as chairman of a Lords committee. And the good thing about suggesting the title of a talk, something to do with the world in disorder, you can be sure it will still be relevant on the day that we're having the discussion, and it sure is. What I propose to do in 20 minutes or so is, first of all, discuss the world in disorder bit. I will say something about the war in Ukraine and something in particular about Israel and Gaza. And then I'll come on to draw a few conclusions from that for the current and future state of UK-EU relations. And then I will welcome discussion of all of that and anything else I've forgotten to say when we come to the discussion period. So let's start with the state of the world very briefly. Everyone is, of course, picking this up every day on the media and in social media. The world is changing at dizzying pace. And all of this is very relevant for the UK and our relations with Europe. Let's start with Ukraine. The first big message from the terrible war that Putin unleashed in Ukraine is that NATO deterrence is working. Putin has respected completely the red line of NATO territory. NATO has become more united, more purposeful, and larger than it's ever been in my career. I was ambassador to NATO at one point in the period after Iraq. And so NATO has responded successfully to the huge challenge of the war in Ukraine. The UK has, I'm glad to say, played a prominent role in that and has, for example, had troops deployed forward in Estonia in cooperation with France and others. America has also risen to the challenge under President Biden of standing with their European allies and providing outstanding support to Ukraine in their struggle against Putin. Second point, the EU has also been far more agile and effective in response to this crisis than I would ever have expected, frankly. It's been a moment where the EU, at long last, began to see itself as a political and security and even a defense power in line with its economic weight. The sanctions imposed by the EU have been more far-reaching than any. European countries have weaned themselves off dependence on Russian oil and gas, which is an extraordinary achievement, given that some were 40 or 50% or more dependent, particularly on Russian gas. And it is a strategic move because it has broken a lever that Putin held over Western Europe. The EU has delivered arms to Ukraine funded collectively from the EU budget. Again, something I would never have expected to see. And individual EU countries have been on quite a journey. I'm sure you'll have seen what the Germans call their Zeitenwende, their sea change in their national security policy. The first fruit of that is a lot more money for the Bundeswehr. It will take time to feed through into a change in German culture in terms of willingness to contemplate and even use the military instrument, but it is another fundamental and long-term shift. Third point on Ukraine, however it finally finishes, it has already been a strategic disaster for Putin. The myth of invincibility of the Russian armed forces has been exploded. Russia finds itself struggling even after more than 18 months of war. It has not made any significant progress in terms of occupation of territory over what it had since 2014. The Russian economy has been weakened, although it kept afloat by the high oil price. Of strategic significance, the Russians have been pushed into the arms of the Chinese. And I do wonder whether that will be seen in time to come as a good place for the Russians to be, and indeed whether that is the seeds of future strife and conflict if that goes on. But the West has also clearly lost ground in the non-aligned capitals. One of the major lessons of the war in Ukraine so far is that when we, the Western countries, went to the capitals of the non-aligned, including major states like India, South Africa, Brazil, Indonesia, and asked for support or at least criticism of Russia over their blatant violation of the UN Charter in invading Ukraine, what we got was, at best, sitting on the fence, and at worst, an active rejection of Western policy in favor of maintaining their links with Russia and with China. What that shows us, I think, is that in the years when our countries were absorbed in international interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan and Libya, in all the turmoil in this country of Brexit and of Trump in America, of the internal tensions within the EU, China was at work in the capitals of the non-aligned world, building a strong position as their investor of choice, in many cases as their leading trading partner. Russia was going around offering weapons to whoever needed them with no strings attached. And if you wanted mercenary as well, Wagner was on hand as well. And so when Western countries rolled up to say, we need your support over Russia and Ukraine, the response tended to be, well, you haven't been there for us. Think about Iraq, how hypocritical of you to have invaded Iraq and then come back and criticize Russia for invading Ukraine. I would say there are deep moral differences between those two, no moral equivalent. Nonetheless, that debating argument is a strong one. They say to us, where have you been when we had regional crises and conflicts that were of concern to us? You haven't delivered on the promises you made for climate financing, for example, or development assistance. And they point to the massive reduction in UK development spending as an example. And so we find ourselves accused in the non-aligned capitals of double standards. And that, I think, has come a shock, and it's something we need to think carefully about for the future. And it's doubly the case since the terrible events in the south of Israel on the 7th of October, awful terrorist attacks and atrocities committed by Hamas. The Western reaction was instinctively, and of course, rightly, to support Israel in its right to defend itself. But as the Israeli military attack on Gaza developed, it looked in many capitals like we were criticizing Russia for bombing Ukrainian cities, but supporting Israel when they bombed the city of Gaza. Again, another case of double standards. China, India, others have stood back from the conflict, stood aloof, looking for opportunities where they can. Russia, of course, is delighted to see America distracted from supporting Ukraine, now committed to a major arms resupply of Israel. How the Israel-Gaza crisis turns out, I think, will also be a marker for where Western countries stand in terms of global influence and capacity to conduct international crisis management. It's certainly true that America has been the indispensable country doing the shuttle diplomacy, the only country that has influence in Israel, working also with the moderate Arab countries. But if you think back to previous Middle Eastern crises, you think of the Yom Kippur War in this period when Henry Kissinger has just passed away, or think of the 1982 Israeli assault on Beirut, where it was the Americans who negotiated the ceasefire and disengagement, and it was Western countries in 1982 who provided the peacekeeping force that allowed that to happen. Just as in Afghanistan or in the Balkans, it was Western countries who led the way in responding to the crisis. In this case, the Americans are in the diplomatic lead, but nobody is talking about Western boots on the ground in Gaza, or indeed Western countries taking a major role in the reconstruction program. It's going to have to be the regional countries, the moderate Arab countries, no doubt with brokering from America, which can produce some sort of settlement in the region and potentially open the way to resume negotiations about a two-state solution. I would argue that Western countries have stepped back quite a long way from the international leadership role they played in previous decades in terms of trying to resolve international conflicts. In many ways, you might say that's the right thing to do, that we should not be exposing Western forces in these cases. But the risk is you get forever wars and constant instability and chaos and human suffering. So let's now draw back from that and think about the implications of this world of disorder for UK-EU relations. And I think the first point I would make is that the return of all-out war to the continent of Europe has had a galvanizing effect on UK-EU relations. I think you can see over the last year and a half, with war in front of us all, it puts everything else into context and perspective. And I think it made both the UK and European capitals and the institutions in Brussels realize that we really had to begin to rebuild a relationship that had become very distant and very scratchy in the years after Brexit. And one can begin to see serious progress as a result of that. Take the issue of sanctions, where the UK and the EU have been working effectively to coordinate sanctions policy, including, I think, exchange of sensitive information. Let me put in a plug here that the Lord's European Affairs Committee is just coming to the end of an inquiry into the implications of the war in Ukraine on UK-EU relations. And one of the things we found is that work on sanctions policy, for example, has opened the door to wider cooperation, some of it quite quiet and not made much of in public, in other areas of national security, in AI, for example, in cyber. We've had Britain opting to join the first of the PESCO projects, the sectoral individual projects, which the EU has been running, and the UK has now, I'm glad to say, decided to join the first of those on military mobility across Europe. So the war in Ukraine, I think, was the point where things really did begin to improve. They also, of course, improved in terms of the bilateral relationship with individual European countries. The UK-French relationship started to strengthen in the light of the war in Europe. Europe's two major military defense powers rightly felt that it was essential that they were working well together in the face of Putin's aggression. And we saw the fruits of that in the UK-French summit on the 10th of March, with a lot of further ideas for cooperation in defense and security. We are not yet at a major turning point in the UK's relations with the EU on foreign and security policy. There is no sign yet of the structured dialogue, which would put in place more regular consultations at ministerial and official level, which was called for in a big report that the Lord's European Affairs Committee did in April this year. But I can see signs of ad hoc cooperation developing in many areas. Everyone, I think, is conscious that when the fighting does wind down in Ukraine, in whatever way that happens, there will be a massive task of reconstruction. The UK and the EU will need to be working closely and effectively together on that. For example, coordinating our work to reduce corruption in Ukraine, which will be essential for the next big step, which is the accession process of Ukraine to the EU. There is a process, which will no doubt be a long process, which has huge strategic implications for the UK as well. The UK will not be at the table, of course, in the EU. We won't have a vote or a voice, but we certainly need to be cooperating with the EU in the wider issues that will arise from the accession of Ukraine to the EU, including, of course, the interface with the prospect of Ukraine joining NATO, where the UK will have a major role to play, and I'm sure will want to press that very hard. So areas of cooperation with the EU that become more urgent and more relevant as a result of the war in Ukraine. I don't think there will be any further institutional advances in the UK-EU relationship this side of the European Parliament elections in June and the British election, whenever that is. But you can already see sectoral deals where it is in the interest of both sides being done. One very positive one, of course, was the Windsor Framework. That was another vital part of improving the tone and the context for relations. Another was the decision to rejoin or to be associated with the Horizon research program, a decision finally concluded this very week. And now we open our newspapers and find that there is a prospect of a 3-year delay in what was otherwise going to be a cliff edge in terms of taxation of cars if they didn't meet the electric vehicle battery rules of origin rules. And that puts 3 more years into the bank for European and British car makers to meet the rules of origin test. All those things are positive. You can see in other areas like North Sea energy cooperation, where the UK and members of the EU, not the EU itself, are working effectively together. So I think the major prospect of any major institutional reform will be after the UK election, probably in the context of the 2025 Trade and Cooperation Agreement review. We can talk about that if you're interested. But in the meantime, a good deal of progress, plenty of issues out there which could still disrupt that. One, of course, is migration and everything associated with migration. We've seen further talk in the last few days of the possibility of emergency legislation to disapply parts of the UK Human Rights Act, even some talk of disapplying some aspects of the European Convention on Human Rights. That would certainly be a very difficult issue with Brussels. Another is the divergence of carbon prices between the UK and the EU. I mean, that's for all kinds of domestically focused reasons, but could store up problems for the future. Coming back to my wider focus on the world of disorder, there are also worrying signs of fractures in the international consensus for support, I should say the Western consensus for support of Ukraine. We've seen the Republican rebellion in Washington against the idea of further major US funding. We've seen the signs in some European countries of fatigue setting in and doubts about how long this can go on. The fact that there are major German budget problems means that there are question marks about how long Germany can maintain its current very, very generous level of support. And over all that hangs the dark cloud of the possibility of Donald Trump winning the White House again late next year. If there was one event that I think would push the UK and the EU closer and faster together again, particularly in foreign and security policy, but also in trade policy, it would be the arrival of a second Trump administration. And it's something we just need to keep in the back of our minds. I'm conscious I've already talked as long as your patience will allow. I think the message from that is that UK-EU relations are significantly better than they were. They are improving. The tone and context is better so that individual issues can be settled on their own merits where there are common interests at stake, rather than being made more difficult by the wider political environment. But there is still much to do, and we are still not at a place where the gains made during the Ukraine war have yet been made permanent and durable. I suppose my key message is that we need to get Ukraine into NATO, where we have a major part to play, and the EU, where we don't, but we have major interests at stake. And I think we need to support the US in reaching for a wider Middle East settlement after the wrenching war in Gaza that produces new opportunities for Palestinians and Israelis to live together. If we could do that, we would show the doubting non-aligned countries that the West still has the resilience and the leadership and the ideas to make the world a safer place. But it is all in the balance. And therefore, it's essential that we continue to work for longer-term strategic cooperation between the UK and the EU. So let me leave it at that and hand the floor back to Richard. And I look forward very much to discussion of anything I have said or things that I haven't.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed for that really panoramic world view and the foreign policy implications for the UK and the EU. Just so much to think and talk about there. But I think we'll go straight on now to hear Nick Harvey, and then we'll come back and have a conversation. So, Nick, can I go straight over to you to respond? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard, and thank you also very much indeed to Lord Ricketts, Peter Ricketts, for a fascinating tour d'horizon, which certainly gave some cause for encouragement, but really probably rather more cause for a great deal of concern. He started his talk by saying quite rightly that the world is changing at a dizzying pace, which it indubitably is, but the implications of many things that are happening at the moment, and of course the looming spectre to which Peter referred of possible Donald Trump's second presidency, gives great cause for alarm on a number of fronts. So the question I would like to put to Peter Ricketts, and I'd be interested to hear what he has to say, would be this. You said, Peter, whatever the outcome, Ukraine is already a strategic disaster for Putin. We can all see what you mean. The whole thing hasn't gone off at all how he imagined that it was going to. But if Trump were to win next autumn and the US were to pull the rug from under the feet of Ukraine, and you mentioned, fatigue in other European states as well, wherever does this all end? I mean, our friends in Eastern and Central Europe would be terrified, and we would have surely seen the dawning of a world where brutes and autocrats can do as they please, and people living in Taiwan will fear for the worst. At that point, won't Putin potentially think he's had a bit of a success?
Do you want me to respond straight away, Nick?
Yes, please.
Okay. Well, why do I think it's been a strategic disaster? First of all, Putin has put Russia through the ringer. He's lost, 100,000 plus dead, many, many more badly wounded. He's shown up desperate weaknesses of command and control and equipment in the Russian armed forces. As I said, he has broken the leverage he held over Western Europe in terms of energy dependency. And I don't think any country in Europe is going to go back to depending on Russia for their energy supplies. He's created a nationalism in Ukraine, which is going to be there for generations, probably including in most of the Russian speaking parts of Ukraine.
Yes.
And he's left NATO expanded with 2 new countries. We still wait finally for the Turkish sign-off of Sweden, but Sweden and Finland will be members. NATO's northern flank is stronger. It's more united. Talk of NATO being brain dead is well over. And he's made the EU wake up to its potential political and security power. All those are, I think, changes that can't be unraveled. I think that they are in the bank. You are right. You can imagine a scenario where he doesn't lose. And I think it's vital that we try to find the resilience to make sure he does lose. But you're right. If with Trump, if with crumbling European support, Ukrainians have to settle for a bad deal, that is a very serious setback. I agree. I think in the worst case, it would be some sort of armistice, truce, leaving Russia in control of some parts of the Donbass and Crimea, and the rest of Ukraine being independent, being a nationalist, turning towards NATO and the EU. That's not a good outcome, but I think that's much more likely than a catastrophic collapse of morale and so on in Ukraine after what they've been through. So yeah, we are not yet at the point where we can be sure that Putin loses, but I don't think he can possibly do anything which looks like a strategic success from here. That would be my answer, although your challenge isn't entirely reasonable one. I always try and like to try and look on the bright side if I can.
EU, you say, at last sees itself as a defence and security power commensurate with its status as an economic power. Has it perhaps been a little bit slow to wake up to the reality that economic power comes with a security implication, that if you want to continue to perform strongly economically, there is a security cost attached to that? And I mean, do you think that this is a permanent mind shift change? And I'm not really suggesting it's simply an EU thing. It's a member states and the UK and anybody else in the European space a concern as well. I mean, again, if Trump looms into view, he's going to sort of finish off some of the things he started talking about first time around, isn't he? We had a chill wind then, but we're still not really doing an awful lot of security on our own behalf, are we?
Well, I agree with you that Europe were free riders in defense and security. You know this from your time as a minister. From 1989, when the Berlin Wall came down, many European countries, including the UK, took a peace dividend and cut their defense spending dramatically and really turned to other things, leaving it essentially to the Americans to do the deterrence of the Soviet Union and then Russia. I think that's absolutely true. And one of the few things I agreed with Trump about was his pressure on the Europeans when he was president to do more, to buck up and start spending what they needed to on their defense. I think Putin has done that job for him. I mean, we've seen a massive change of mood in Germany. As I said, it will take years to feed through into real hard military capability, ordering the new weapon systems, recruiting more people into the Bundeswehr, making up for the decades of neglect. That can be done, but changing the mindset into a more military oriented mindset will take time, of course. But I do think that the recognition in EU capitals, European capitals more widely, that it's a dangerous place out there and we need to be spending enough to keep us safe. I think that has happened. And I think the arrival of Trump in the White House would just push that further and faster. You're right. If Americans pulled out of NATO and pulled back US forces from Europe, we'd be in a mess because we can't replace them. We don't have the strategic forces and the crucial assets that the Americans supply. But I would just condition your worst case scenario a little bit. There is still very strong support in Congress on both sides of the aisle for NATO. I think it's one of the areas, along with opposition to China, where there is something like bipartisan support in Congress. So even Trump in the White House, I'm not sure he would have the constitutional power to pull the US out of NATO. I think that constitutionally, the making and unmaking of treaties is for the Senate. So yes, it would be a terrible 4 years. Silver lining, he can't have a third term under the US Constitution. And the checks and balances worked in the first term. And I think on NATO, they might work in the second term. So you're right to hoist a signal of alarm, but I think there are some mitigations of it.
It's interesting. Can he not have a third term as long as it's not consecutive?
I'm told not. No, I think the Constitution is clear that an individual can only serve 2 terms, whether consecutive or not.
Well,
somebody on the chat and somebody on the call may be able to correct us. That's my understanding.
You touched in a very interesting way on Russia and China both having been active in the non-aligned world in such an extent that by the time we came knocking on the door looking for support in Ukraine and more recently wondering where these countries stood in the Israel-Gaza conflict, to what extent do you think they together? Russia launched its assault upon Ukraine. the Chinese only eventually offered muted criticism when the global economy, and by extension the Chinese economy, took a bit of a shock effect from that. I mean, the world is changing, as you said. The Chinese are in the ascent as the US is in gentle descent. We may come to a point of a bipolar world leadership, or perhaps China will eclipse the US in terms of world leadership. I mean, are the Chinese and the Russians and others actively working to accelerate that and bring that about? And if so, have we been slow really to wake up to and recognize that?
I don't think there's a sort of deep plot that has been hatched that we've missed. No, China is a strong, rising, confident country that is elbowing its way into a larger role in the world, competing with America in Asia, competing with America on next generation technology. Russia is a declining power demographically, economically, that is losing relative economic position in the world, and is behaving recklessly in an effort, I think, to try and stem that tide. So they're not exactly aligned. The Chinese, I think, have had a long 20-year plan. Some of it is the Belt and Road Initiative, to both be active across Africa, across Latin America, in many parts of Asia, offering eye-watering sums of money for investment in infrastructure, but also converting a lot of these countries into their leading trading partner. So establishing a very strong alignment of economic interests with many countries. Russia has been much more episodic, I mean, taking opportunities where they can see them to foster chaos, disorder, and then offering their help for weak regimes needing a strong hand. It's a tactical alliance of interests, I think, and I would see very much Russia the junior partner of an alliance with China. China gets cheap oil from Russia; that's very handy to them. Russia is effectively becoming part of the renminbi zone because of the sanctions against the ruble, but China is the dominant partner in that. And it's been interesting that Xi Jinping hasn't given absolutely unconditional support to Putin in Ukraine, and particularly when Putin was getting, very menacing about nuclear weapons, it looked as if Xi Jinping said, "No, cut that out. We're not up for, threatening or using nuclear weapons." So they're not directly aligned, but they have some similar interests, and together they are offering something to non-aligned countries that we are not. Financing, trading opportunities, arms, not pushing them on human rights, criticizing them over the rule of law. It's relatively value-free, very value-free economic and military support. And last point, China presents this model, which is quite interesting, I think, in many non-aligned countries. You can have the economic success without having to have the political liberalization and opening. For a long time, we thought that economic success would bring with it demands of populations for political choice. And I think the Chinese are going quite a long way to showing that you can separate the two. You don't have to concede, on your authoritarian rule in order to have your economic success. So it is a genuine competition we're in. A country like India, I think, would be best termed something like multi-aligned, because it's very happy to work with America against China. It's happy to take Russian oil, Russian weapons. It keeps its lines open to the Chinese as well. And it's playing hard in the third world, what used to be called the third world. So it's a very complex picture, but we should have seen coming, I agree with you, the shift in the terms of trade, if you like, in many non-aligned capitals against Western interests.
Last one for me before I hand back to Richard. You mentioned that we have an election next year, possibly May, possibly October. It looks as though Keir Starmer will be the Prime Minister afterwards. He's not keen to talk about Europe before the election, but he has shown a little bit of ankle. You mentioned a trade and cooperation agreement review. He has said that he would like that to go beyond the rather dry technical exercise which is enshrined in the treaty and use it to open up some more fundamental questions, or possibly that would go on in a separate process. But he sounds as if that's relatively brisk early business he wants to attend to. Do you think that if he does win and has a good working majority, he's going to start really packing in a different direction than what we have been used to? And I suppose my final little corollary to that, if you were a betting man, we're approaching Christmas 2023 now. Do you think as we approach Christmas 2038, you will be a European citizen again, along with the rest of us?
Oh, Nick, heavens. Well, I'm going to be evasive on your first point, because I'm not a politician. I'm a careful crossbench neutral peer chairing a Lords committee. I don't know, of course, exactly what Labour Party policy will be. I think you're right that there's a lot of work going on behind the scenes to prepare. No doubt there is on both sides. I think in terms of what the EU would be willing to do, my own feeling is that they're not going to be ready for a major leap forward just because a new British government shows up saying, well, perhaps all that was a bit of a mistake. We need to move on, and let's, try and really do something radical on the trade and cooperation agreement. I think if a government of any stripe shows up and says that, the answer will be, sorry, no, we've got many other priorities. I mentioned the huge issue of accession, not just of Ukraine, but a whole package of other countries, many strains within the EU, including the migration package. We are not about to down tools on everything else and spend the next few years renegotiating with the UK. So I think whichever government it is, it would continue to be incremental improvements, issue by issue, sector by sector, where there were mutual interest to do that, rather than a great leap forward. And so I would hope that any government of any colour that comes in will be prepared for tough negotiation issue by issue and be realistic about what they're likely to achieve. And again, I think I'll evade your last point, except to say this. Again, very much me personally talking, I think in 10 or 15 years' time, the UK will be different. A new generation will be in power. The EU will be different. I've said in my book that the new generation in the UK, as I talk to them and see them, they don't have hang-ups about Europe and the EU. They're not hung up about sovereignty. They are much more interested in the climate, in human rights, in values, and I suspect the young generation in the EU will be the same. So, a changed EU and a changed UK might find a new place to meet. I think I'll just leave it there.
Thank you, Peter. It's lovely talking to you again, and I will stop hogging the floor and ask Richard to bring in online questioners.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Just getting myself on, I think. Yes, there we are. Well, thank you both very, very much again for a most instructive and illuminating discussion. Just one question from me. I mean, I was going to ask Peter if I could bring you back a little bit more to the specific issue of UK and EU relations in the slightly longer term, because you were focusing in your talk, I think, about things which are pretty imminent. I must say it's both sort of salutary and perhaps, I don't know, it's encouraging, but it's like the feeling of it's an ill wind that blows no one any good, when you explain how war has galvanized UK and EU relations, and the prospect of Trump would probably galvanize them even more. I mean, it is good to hear that there are potential silver linings in such a disordered world. But just looking a little bit further ahead, I'm thinking about the EU particularly now. and how it might change, it does seem to me it is facing this tremendous question about enlargement versus integration, and how you, the sort of almost the political necessity, as you were pointing out, of enlargement, given Putin's behavior, and yet the extreme difficulty of integrating states like Ukraine under current sanctions. And therefore, whether you could give us any thoughts about the alternative visions of the more integrated, more federalist Europe, which someone like Guy Verhofstadt obviously feels very strongly about, and more perhaps the Macron, the German view of the sort of concentric circles Europe. I mean, it seems to me that the UK is bound to have a far better chance of, far more likely to rejoin the latter than the former.
Yes.
But the imperative that we rejoin.
Well, I think you're right, first of all, about the scale of the challenge to the EU of concluding this enormous package of potential enlargement that they put together: Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, and the Western Balkans candidate countries as well. That is an enormous package. And I would just observe that Ukraine presents the unique challenge for the EU of being relatively poor in terms of per capita income, but having a large and very efficient agricultural sector. I mean, you could almost, if you wanted to design a country that is awkward to include in the EU, given its current policies, it would be that. So successful enlargement will mean, of course, a large reform in the Ukraine, in which the UK can play a major part, but also far-reaching reform, I would say, in the EU. It's not my place to advise the EU, but it seems to me the implications for budgets, for structural funds, for common agricultural policy, perhaps for voting in the council, there's some very, very significant issues. And so I think, personally, that this will tend to bring the EU back towards the idea of concentric circles. I mean, we're all speculating here. I'm marked by my periods in Paris. I've served twice in the embassy in Paris, first time in the 1990s, when there was something called the Lammers-Schäuble plan, which was a concentric circles plan for the future of the EU, hatched in Berlin, something the French were very keen about and still are, and still see that probably as a way of reconciling what you talk about, that there will still be some countries who are attached to tight integration, and there will be others at different levels of development coming in as part of this new package, and some others, current members of the EU, who will be more interested in perhaps a looser, more flexible arrangement for the future. I mean, saying that is easy. Getting there, getting that negotiating through the EU and ratified by all the countries is a monumental issue. And it is one that will have strategic implications for the UK, which is why we need to stay very closely monitoring what's going on, and where we can and where we're invited to, offering thoughts.
Will it leave the EU as a less effective geopolitical force if it's concentric circles?
Well, it'll be larger in every way, larger, of course, in population, larger in GDP. You know, its political throw weight and economic throw weight in the world, to use a term from the military, will be greater. Can it be an effective operator at that level? History will show.
Thank you very much. Right. Well, I think, Michael, let's now throw the floor open to questions, and over to you to introduce them.
Yep, excellent. Thank you, Richard. Thank you, everyone, for sending in your questions. We won't be able to just take all of them, unfortunately. There's been quite a few, and we've got a bit of a time limitation. But I can see that some of the questions have already been answered by what Lord Ricketts has said. So I guess that's good. So we're going to start with a question from Rainer Hilbrand to Lord Ricketts. By how much does Hungary's Russia-friendly position influence Europe's support for Ukraine?
Well, it's a very good question. It clearly makes more difficult maintaining EU unity on Ukraine. But Hungary has many, many interests at stake in the EU as well, not least funding and support for the Hungarian economy, of course, access to the EU market and so on. And therefore, it's not a one-sided issue. I think Hungary has to weigh, as you say, what seems to be an instinctive, more pro-Russian line than other EU member states, with their dependence on the EU in many ways. And I suspect Mr. Orban, who's a very, very skilled political operator, will find a way of navigating that. I do not think Hungary alone will be able to stand in the way of continued EU support in a large measure to the Ukraine, in particular, this massive reconstruction task coming up.
Lisa. Next question is from Magdalena Williams. Do you think that EU expansion and the necessary treaty change as proposed by the European Parliament will make it easier for the UK to apply to join the single market and customs union, which is so vital for the UK economy?
Gosh, I don't know. I really don't know. I think I would give the same answer as I gave to Nick, that the kind of changes that will be required in the EU in order to absorb countries like Ukraine and the remaining Western Balkans countries seem to me are likely to make the EU a more flexible, a more variable geometry structure. And in that change, there are potential opportunities for the UK. Whether it would mean the UK rejoining the formal mechanisms of the single market and the customs union, I don't know. Certainly not in the current political mood in the UK, and I don't see that changing in the immediate years ahead.
Okay. Thank you, Peter. A question with a slightly different angle now, the education angle from Ray Kurtzley. Ray says, UK schools have lost many opportunities for collaborative learning as a result of the UK leaving the Erasmus Plus programme. If the UK rejoined the EU's e-twinning programme, this would be a low-cost precursor to restoring the benefits of the whole Erasmus Plus programme, such as apprenticeships, work placements, and student exchanges. What strategies do you suggest we should adopt for this very modest aim of returning to Erasmus Plus, when most commentators and politicians think of it only in terms of higher education?
Okay, excellent question. Thank you very much indeed. And I agree. The issue of youth mobility, which is really what we're talking about here, is more than Erasmus Plus. I think the issue of Erasmus will clearly be a political choice for a future government. But there is a lot going on already. We've just had in London in the last few days the EU-UK Parliamentary Partnership Assembly, which is 35 members of the UK Parliament, including me, and 35 members of the European Parliament, meeting together twice a year in an assembly. One of the big themes of that gathering this year, as it has been in the past, has been the impact on young people of Brexit and the capacity of young people to move around Europe, to study, to work, to settle, to fall in love in the kind that my generation had. And there are a number of things we can do short of Erasmus. One is school visits. The UK and the French have already said that they are going to ease the restrictions on school visits so that school classes can visit on the basis of a collective document, not individual passports. Touring artists, another area which has been badly hit by Brexit, lots of extra red tape. Again, a lot of interest on both sides in finding ways of opening that up. And then a lot of support for what we've called the youth mobility visa, which would allow young people a year or even 2 years in order to work or study in another country, another EU or UK, with minimum additional bureaucracy. Those are the sorts of issues that governments and parliamentarians are thinking about, which are short of a full-scale return to Erasmus.
Yeah, thank you for that, Peter, and for your question, Ray. Next question, we're going to take one from Mark Wetton. He asks, how does Lord Ricketts see the spectre of climate change impacting global and EU stability, especially regarding the potential to play into the narrative of right-wing popularist politics that would also destabilise EU and NATO?
Gosh, these are all very good and very large and broad-ranging questions. Clearly, climate change is going to have an impact on relations between countries across the world. It is something that is already being seen, but it is, among other things, a potential security threat to Western Europe. We can already see the pressures of migration. If you've seen the collapse of the French position in the Sahel, having to pull out their military bases and losing their political position in a number of countries, like Mali, like Burkina Faso, like Niger. Climate change is at the root of that. There's a lot of desertification of unemployed people drifting to the towns and becoming radicalized. The migration flows towards Europe are partly driven by climate as well, and it will go on being a major factor. So it is a major issue for the EU, UK and the EU. It's an area where we are both basically aligned. The EU and the UK both have in their law 2050 net zero target. They have some quite challenging 2030 targets. They're all together at the moment in the COP conference going on in Dubai, trying to forge a wider global agreement. It's an area where the UK and the EU are, I think, and need to be working very closely together and closely linked to the whole area of renewable green energy as well. So yes, it's a growing issue for all our countries, and it's one where the UK and the EU ought to be working closely together on.
On that subject of collaboration, Charlotte and Barley asks, is the UK collaborating with our EU neighbours on cyber warfare? If so, how? And should there be more?
I mean, the answer, I believe, is yes, because that's what the Minister, Mr. Doherty from the Foreign Office, confirmed to us in the Parliamentary Assembly this week. The real focus for work on cyber defence is NATO, where it's a major factor, preparing for potential cyber attacks during a future conflict, but also resilience in the short term. But we are told that there's also now an active UK-EU dialogue on cyber defence and cyber security. And indeed, the UK held a big global conference on cyber security recently at Bletchley Park, to which Ursula von der Leyen, President of the EU Commission, came and played a major part. So the UK and the EU with the Americans are working together on this vital issue of how to regulate AI, how to ensure that AI can develop in a way that is safe from cyber attack. And that is an area, again, where I think the UK and the EU are working together.
Excellent. Thank you, Peter. Next question is from Andrew Hadley. Lord Ricketts, you have spoken about Trump, but could you also say something a little bit more about the wild cards closer to home, such as Orban, Fico, Wilders, etc.? What effect might they have on the cohesion of the EU's foreign policy, including its cooperation with the UK?
Well, I mean, again, very good question. We can see a rising tide of populism, I think, in many EU countries, and we've seen that in the countries that you mentioned. Also, the strengthening position of AfD in Germany. So there is a lot of dissatisfaction for all sorts of reasons. Migration is clearly one of them. And as if these leaders come to power, there could be implications. I would just note that Giorgia Meloni in Italy, who was seen as a populist, rather hard right-leaning politician, in power has been much more mainstream, at least in her foreign policy, on NATO, on supporting the EU position on Ukraine, and hasn't proved to be the wild card that people thought she might have been. I think in her domestic policies, she is, notably to the right of previous Italian prime ministers. So it is, yes, it's another of these wild cards. It's not perhaps quite as major a wild card as it is in the US, because in countries like the Netherlands, it's not at all clear how that's going to play out. Would it actually change broad Netherlands policy towards the UK, EU, NATO? I rather doubt that. But it's a reason for concern that in many of our European neighbours, the populist, particularly far right parties, are strengthening. I agree.
Thank you, Peter. Next question is more of a reflective one, and it's from Sarah Page. You've done very well batting those off there, Peter. Sarah asks, do you think that if there had been the same level of positive discussion on the importance of being part of the European Union during the years leading up to 2016, that the population of the UK would have been in a better place to fully understand some of the issues attached to Brexit?
Well, I think my short answer is yes, because public information is always good. My own feeling, and I think I say this in my book, is that British political leaders over 30 years failed to explain to the British people what the European project was all about. Having served in France, as I say, I know that people learn from school age onwards that Europe is about peace. The EU is a peace project. It's about peace and reconciliation with neighbors, never again allowing the horrors of the Second World War between members of the European Union. And in secondary, or it's a tool to achieve that, is the common market, the single market, the customs union, the instruments of economic integration. But the purpose of it is peace and security. And that was never the proposition sold to the British people. The proposition was we're joining a common market, and then the idea that this was a larger organization with wider goals came as a surprise to people as they discovered it. And so I think there's been that fundamental failing, really, of generations of British politicians who weren't level with the British people about what the EU project, the European project, let's call it, was about. And therefore, I mean, without going into all the politics of Brexit, when that issue suddenly came on the agenda, many people didn't have the base, didn't have the foundation that citizens in other EU countries had, because their politicians had at least tried and schools had taught, and it was part of the kind of general culture to understand that was the basis for where the Treaty of Rome came from. So I think we were always at a disadvantage there because of that basic political failing.
Thank you, Peter. Next question is from Jane Khan. The migration issue is driving the increase in support for far-right and anti-EU parties. Is there a solution?
If I had a solution,
before I take us back to the broad level,
I would have offered it to the government by now. There isn't a solution. It's a problem that has to be managed. I've been saying that about the asylum seekers coming to the UK, seeking to come to the UK for 20 years. This isn't a problem that the UK can solve. It's not a problem the UK and France and others working together can solve. We can manage it. We can try and reduce the incentives for asylum seekers to risk their lives on these journeys. And much the same is true of the far greater number who are making their way across the Mediterranean, from North Africa or Eastern Mediterranean, from the unstable countries of the Middle East. And it is only likely to get greater pressure as migration is fueled by climate change, by shortages, food shortages, all the impacts, water shortages that come from that. So this is a problem that we're going to have to be managing, not solving, and it's going to need a great deal of cooperation, including from the countries where migrants are setting off from. I think one of the mitigations is greater investment in those countries, both to mitigate climate impacts and also to help with economic development, to give people more incentive to stay at home rather than to seek their chance in Europe. Europe can't take in all the migrants of the world, and this is a problem that is only going to continue to grow. I don't, I'm afraid, have a magic solution.
Mike,
a very good answer to it.
I think we may.
I was going to say that. Oh, sorry, go on, Richard.
We're going to have one more, or Richard,
One more.
what do you think?
Yeah.
Okay.
I was going to just about to say, yeah, we'll make the next one the last one. I think you did very well making a very open-ended question there. Digestible. Well done, Peter. Last one I'm going to take is from David Hogg. This is more at a UK level. Lord Ricketts, if Labour takes a lot of seats from the SNP in the next general election, do you think that Starmer and the Labour leadership might move closer in terms of alignment to the European Union?
Well, do you know, I can't and don't want to try and speculate about what Keir Starmer, if he comes into power, might do. I think all I will say is that the arrival of a new government in the UK, especially if it had a clear parliamentary mandate, would be of great interest across EU capitals. People are always interested in a new political leader. Where does he stand? What does he want to do? How has he got elected? What was his secret? What can I learn from that? So there would be a lot of interest around Europe. Ears would be open, I'm sure. But as I tried to say earlier, I think it would be a mistake to assume that simply being a new political leader will open doors to far-reaching change with the UK's relationship with the EU. For the moment, it's going to be implementing that trade and cooperation agreement rather than going back to square one. And thank you for an amazingly complicated and far-reaching and interesting and challenging set of questions.
Thank you, Peter. Well done.
Thank you, Michael. I mean, I think, Peter, you slightly asked for it with the title you chose for your talk of EU and UK relations in a world of disorder. It certainly was an extraordinarily wide-ranging title, and it provoked the most wide-ranging and interesting discussion. And thank you enormously for that. If I could just say one thing, one of the questions towards the end was about public awareness in the UK about Europe pre-Brexit. And I do feel you are so absolutely right in what you said about the level of, frankly, ignorance was a major, major factor in the Brexit decision. And I just want to say that this particular committee, the International Committee, was founded and exists absolutely to promulgate a deeper understanding of Europe. And you have contributed this evening to that enormously. And thank you very, very much indeed from all of us.
Thank you for having me, Richard. It's been a privilege.